Over the course of China's imperial history, perhaps the most important tasks for dynasties were the construction and maintenance of infrastructure, the roads and canals that knit this vast empire together. None was more important or problematic than the Grand Canal, which is among the largest public works projects in human history, and a vital economic lifeline even today. The original Grand Canal was the brainchild of Emperors Wen and Yang of the short-lived Sui dynasty, dates 581 to 618 CE. They undertook a massive project of expanding and extending a canal system that linked the North China Plain to the Yangtze River Valley. As the world's largest man-made waterway, the Grand Canal would serve as a means of integrating imperial China. It's a great source of disruption and disintegration as well. There's almost a dark reverse to everything positive about the Grand Canal. The cities along its route were famous for their arts, their culture, for their manufacturing. But they were also infamous for their crime, their corruption, and their loose morals. The men who worked its barges and locks were crucial to a functioning empire. But they could also be a source of anti-dynastic rebellion. But more on that later. It's hard to argue against the importance of hydraulic management in China's imperial history. The irrigation works at Duzhongyan in Sichuan province were a major factor in the rise of the Qin kingdom in the late Warring States period in the 3rd century BCE. The agricultural surplus produced by a consistent water supply kept the Qin armies fed on their bloody march to power. The king of Qin would become the first emperor of China in 221. Duzhongyan is still functioning and provides water and water power for millions of Chinese farmers. It's also hard to argue against the utility of canals. A single draft animal might be able to pull, say, a 2-ton cart on a dry level road. That same animal can pull 50 tons along a canal. And as Chinese civilization crept southward from the North China Plain, especially into the marshes and deltas of the Yangtze River Valley, canals, both public and private, came to delineate the landscape. In the north, canals linked the major rivers, such as the Huai in Anhui province, with the Yellow River, and were built alongside rivers that tended to silt up. Silting was a major problem in North China. It's called the Yellow River because of the billions of tons of yellowish-brown soil that muddy its waters, that clog up irrigation works along its course, and silt up canals. But back to the origins of the Grand Canal. In 581 CE, a general named Yang Jian proclaimed a new dynasty, the Sui, honoring himself as its Wendi, its civil emperor. To create legitimacy for his dynasty, Emperor Wen chose Chang'an, the capital of the earlier Qin and Western Han dynasties, as his capital. It would become the medieval world's greatest city. But Chang'an was a problematic choice for capital. The city had excellent connectivity to the land routes to Central Asia and to China's southwest, but it was less well connected to the Yellow River floodplain to the east and almost completely cut off from the south and southeast, especially from the fertile Yangtze River Valley. To solve that problem, Emperor Wen expanded a canal originally dug during the Han Dynasty in the 2nd century BCE. It stretched 100 miles east from Chang'an to the Yellow River. That was a strategic and economic move. Strategic because it extended the reach of the state east to the populous North China Plain. And economic because it brought food and trade to the capital. Not content with reinvigorating just one ancient capital, Emperor Wen started a second huge imperial city at Luoyang, which had been the capital of the Eastern Han. He then accelerated canal projects to link his twin capitals to the Yangtze River to the south and north as far as modern Beijing. The logic of the Grand Canal was simple. China's two great rivers, the Yellow and the Yangtze, run east to west. North-south canals connect those two rivers and the millions of people that live along them. Throughout its history, the Grand Canal was big government in action. Many of the barges that plied these waterways were owned by the government and crewed by soldiers and later hereditary boatmen. Initially, the canal was supposed to pay for itself. Operating expenses were to be collected as transit fees, and upkeep was to be done by what's called corvée labor. That's the 20 or 30 days a year of free labor that your average farmer owed to the government. It sounds good in theory, but keeping the canal in good working order was expensive and a truly complex proposition. And decentralized fee collection and labor conscription were both rife with corruption and totally inadequate to the needs of maintenance of a public works project of this magnitude. As we'll see, canal maintenance became an obsession of dynasties for the next 1,400 years. One reason for that were the absolutely indispensable commodities shipped by the canal. Obviously, there was grain, that's rice from the fertile south to feed garrisons on the arid frontiers. Then there was salt. Millions of tons of the preservative were shipped from China's coasts inland. Silk and tea from the south clothed and refreshed northern city dwellers. Were traded for horses from the great grasslands to the north, and they made their way by caravan to Central Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. Another crucial commodity was timber. Timber for grain barges and for new cities cropping up along the canals. Wood for paper, for books and bookkeeping. Paper for the bureaucrats who ran the immense imperial government. And for paper, money and bills of exchange. In time, an insatiable appetite for wood products contributed to the deforestation, soil erosion, and silting that further complicated the maintenance of the canals and wrought incalculable damage to China's ecology. But it wasn't just north and south that the Grand Canal connected. With its southern terminus at the seaport of Hangzhou, the waterway connected inland regions to the trade networks of East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Indian Ocean. By the 8th century, there were Arabs and Persians living on China's southeast coast and in Chang'an and Luoyang, and Korean merchant enclaves in the northeast and along the Grand Canal. In the 13th century, they were joined by Hindus, Genoese, and Venetians. The points where the canal connected to China's lakes and rivers, sites like Hangzhou, Suzhou, and Yangzhou, would become some of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world. Yangzhou was famous for its silks, its sugar, its shipyards, its cabinet makers, and for its exquisite bronze mirrors. Other canal cities were reconfigured to take advantage of water transportation, resulting in places like Suzhou, the Venice of China. Canals bustling with commercial activity crisscrossed these urban centers, where merchants on boat and on land spoke Chinese, Korean, Khmer, Vietnamese, Arabic, Persian, and Italian. Here's a verse from a 9th century poet about Suzhou. Over the rivers, small bridges are many. Water chestnut fruits and lotus roots are sold in late evening markets. And spring boats are loaded with luxurious silken fabrics. In the distance, I know that wakeful under the moon, homesickness will be accompanied by fishermen's songs. So China's canals provided more than political and economic integration. They fired the creative imagination and facilitated the diversification of Chinese culture. Everything from poetry to cuisine flowed through networks of exchange. The Grand Canal also moved people. Officials moved easily from one assignment to the next, and communiques quickly reached the far-flung corners of the empire. Partly because of the Grand Canal, the scholar elite of South China, a group we call the literati, came to dominate the imperial bureaucracy in the second millennium, even when the dynasty was ruled from the north and by foreign dynasties like the Manchu Qing dynasty from the 17th to the 20th centuries. The canal was also the route for imperial inspection tours. The first of these was undertaken by Emperor Yang of the Sui in the early 7th century. Inspection tours were grand and opulent demonstrations of imperial power. They also provided the emperor with valuable intelligence on economic and social conditions. Emperor Kangxi of the Qing dynasty, who reigned from 1661 to 1722, said of these tours, and I quote, "I learned of the common people's grievances by talking with them, by accepting their petitions. I asked them about their officials and looked at their houses and discussed their crops." The Sui dynasty's waterways began, as we saw, by connecting and expanding existing canals. It was still an immense undertaking and indicative of the manpower China's dynasties could mobilize. 6 million peasants are said to have been dragooned during the first decade of the 7th century alone. That's probably an exaggeration, but it's not over the top, given that all that earth and rock had to be moved by hand. To dig, expand, and connect 1,000 miles of waterways 100 to 200 feet wide. That was done in less than a decade. The Sui did with canals what the earlier Qin dynasty had done with imperial roads. And the results were similar. Massive building projects, mass conscription of labor, in some cases imperial overreach, fired disaffection among the elites and provoked peasant rebellions. The Qin was toppled after 15 years and the Sui after 37. And yet, like the Qin's roads, the Sui's canals proved essential to the extended period of imperial unity that followed, in this case under the Tang dynasty, dates 618 to 907. But it was more than pure brawn that created the Grand Canal. There was advanced surveying and sophisticated hydraulic engineering. To widen and deepen existing waterways, the water had to be stopped or diverted by dams and temporary canals. In smaller works, cofferdams consisting of straw mats caked with mud were boomed into place. But big canals required more substantial diversions. As a channel was dredged, widened, and straightened, dirt and stone piled up as berms along each side, berms topped with paths along which draft animals towed barges. Periodically, spurs were dug along the flanks of a canal to feed or drain water, or to irrigate surrounding fields. As the digging progressed, the workers and engineers and their temporary towns would move along the channel. The early Grand Canal had 24 major locks. Locks are transition points between different water levels. The 7th century Grand Canal feature what's called flash locks. It's basically a dam that holds back the downstream flow. When enough downstream traffic is queued up, the dam is opened and the traffic shoots the lock. To get upstream, larger vessels have to be winched or towed through the open lock. Smaller craft can be dragged up or down the side of the lock on dry double slipways. All this was expensive and incredibly labor-intensive. A major flash lock slipway facility required a labor force of 500 men and a significant outlay of cash every year. During the Song dynasty, that dates 960 to 1279, a hydraulic engineer by the name of Chao Wei-yo invented the pound lock. It's the precursor to modern locks. There are gates at each end of the water, gates at each end, and water is let in or out depending on the direction of the traffic. Pound locks sped transit, and less time waiting meant less time for the denizens of these choke points to steal cargo or to extort bribes from barge captains. Pound locks also made it possible to extend the Grand Canal across Shandong province, right up to modern Beijing. At their peak, Shandong's locks were 138 feet above sea level and fed by an immense uphill reservoir to provide the summit with enough water. And pound locks increased capacity. The biggest ships that could make it through flash locks were about 15 tons. Pound locks could accommodate grain ships carrying 100 tons. Between the locks, barges could cover up to 45 miles a day. During the Tang Dynasty, that meant cargoes from the Yangtze Delta reached Chang'an in 3 to 4 weeks. Volume was also impressive. Enin, a Japanese monk who visited China in the late 9th century, marveled at China's canals. He described flotillas of 30 to 40 barges pulled upstream by a single pair of water buffalo, and noted one flotilla of salt barges that were tied together 4 abreast and stretched out for more than a mile. The Tang Dynasty official, Cui Rong, wrote, "Great ships in thousands and tens of thousands carry goods back and forth. If they lay unused for a single moment, 10,000 merchants would be bankrupted." To give you some idea of the scale of canal traffic, a fire in the Imperial grain fleet in 751 killed 600 sailors, burned 215 government barges, incinerated 130 million pounds of rice, and destroyed hundreds of commercial vessels. Once it was complete, entire occupations, entire ways of life sprang up around the Grand Canal, further diversifying and commercializing an already busy economy. Ships' crews and itinerant merchants lived a shipboard existence. We even hear of floating brothels. At ports and locks, imperial customs agents, granary managers, shipping brokers, money changers, haulers, hawkers, and stevedores populated this mobile world, a stark contrast to the lives of peasants still bound to the soil. And the Grand Canal endured even in times of dynastic territorial division. In 1127, the Song dynasty was driven from its capital, Kaifeng, which sits at the transept of the Grand Canal system. Canal operations were disrupted for a time, but once the Song negotiated an uneasy peace with the people called the Jurchen, who had conquered North China, the canal reopened as a conduit for the silk and grain trade. After the Mongols completed their conquest of China in 1279, Kublai Khan was eager to expand and improve the canals. Spurs of the Grand Canal were brought into Khanbalik, modern Beijing. The spur canal terminated just north of the man-made lakes for which Beijing is now famous. It was then possible to travel by boat from Kublai's capital all the way to the city of Hangzhou. Marco Polo traveled this route on his way home from his time at the court of the Great Khan. Civil war in the 14th century disrupted and damaged China's canals, but they were quickly repaired under the Ming Dynasty, dates 1368 to 1644. The canal project sponsored by the Ming Emperor Yongle in the early 1400s added 15 new locks in Shandong province alone. The imperial transport fleet would now grow to number 15,000 barges and employ 160,000 crew. China's last dynasty, the Qing, shared the Ming obsession with keeping the canals up and running. The Grand Canal, however, was not entirely a boon. It was expensive to maintain, vulnerable to the elements, and as much as it served to integrate imperial China, it was also an economic, political, and strategic vulnerability. The Grand Canal was thus a metaphor for the variable health of the imperial system. When China was united and vigorous, as it was during the early years of dynasties like the Tang, Song, Ming, and Qing, the canal was in good repair and a source of prosperity and unity. When imperial China was weak and divided, as it was for much of the 14th and 17th centuries, and in the decades leading up to the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, the canal system became sclerotic and a source of political and social upheaval. A major strategic problem arose from a fundamental paradox of the late imperial period, which was the location of the imperial capital. With only a few brief exceptions, imperial China was ruled from what is now Beijing from the 13th to the 20th centuries. All the great cities that occupied this spot were first and almost exclusively bureaucratic and military centers. It's not a natural spot for a city. To feed the officials and soldiers who populated Beijing required millions of tons of cereals. This was called the grain tribute. But how to get it to the capital? The only way was by ship. Even then, the exact answer wasn't perfectly clear. Grain transport by sea was usually cheaper and faster and less susceptible to theft and less plagued by corruption. But if a grain fleet sank during a storm, the capital and frontier garrisons might starve. But at the same time, the canal was vulnerable to silting, especially in the north where it crossed the Yellow River. And a drought could stop all shipping entirely. Floods could be even more catastrophic, and administrative neglect was yet another chronic vulnerability. The Grand Canal demanded intense management. The movement of the tribute grain had to be carefully timed to seasonal variations of wind and rainfall, and maintenance had to be assiduous before, during, and after the northward and southward transits of the fleet. The how of transporting tribute grain became a major policy issue in Imperial China. And because it was essential for the political health and economic well-being of dynasties, poor management of the canal became a sign of imperial decline, whereas active maintenance and frequent improvements were usually taken to be symbols of imperial vigor. During the 15th century, several dikes on the Yellow River collapsed, devastating the canals and locks and silting up channels and limiting water supplies to the upper elevations. It took decades to repair the damage, and even then the repairs were only temporary. In the 1630s, the faltering Ming dynasty couldn't adequately feed the capital or its armies. The dynasty fell to a lethal combination of peasant rebellion and foreign invasion, in part because of the breakdown of the canal. The Manchu rulers of the Qing dynasty, again dates 1644 to 1911, took an intense interest in the Grand Canal, in part because of those lessons of the earlier Ming, and also because of the virulent anti-Manchu sentiment in many of the provinces through which the canal passed. Because the health of the canal became emblematic of dynastic legitimacy, there are several examples of Qing emperors taking personal charge over a canal crisis. In other words, the most powerful man in the world wading into the minutiae of hydraulic management. The Qing's obsession with the canal turned into an expensive trap. In the face of man-made disasters like the bloody Taiping Rebellion of the 1850s and 60s, and catastrophic shifts in the course of the Yellow River, as happened in 1854 and again in 1887, the canal route had to be abandoned. That was in 1901, a decade before China's last emperor abdicated. And yet, despite its problems, the transport of the tribute grain by the canal persisted for centuries because it had a potent lobby. Thousands of officials who staffed the grain transport system, who collected customs duties, who oversaw the maintenance of channels and locks, and who governed the cities and counties along its course, well, they were invested in its survival. Merchants were also vocal advocates. The one group most heavily invested in the canal, and a source of much of its infamy, were the boatmen of the grain tribute fleet itself. Initially, these were drawn from the military, but were later organized into hereditary households settled on imperial lands. Each generation of hereditary boatmen were allotted food and other expenses for the seasonal barge transit, and an annual stipend of grain and silver. They could also transport their own trade goods on board government barges. By the Qing dynasty, that's in the 17th and 18th centuries, most of the land grants given over to these boatmen had actually been illegally sold off by corrupt officials, and the bulk of the grain transport fleet was manned by itinerant laborers. Sitting idle and unpaid for months at a time, the boatmen established their own mutual aid societies that helped the impoverished, the sick and injured, and the old and infirm among their ranks. These mutual aid societies in turn evolved into a powerful guild. Trouble was brewing. The Boatmen's Guild developed an ominous reputation. A lot of this had to do with their adoption of a form of Buddhism known as Luo Jiao, literally the teachings of Patriarch Luo. Patriarch Luo was a boatman himself. He crafted a doctrine of devotion and salvation that appealed to the poor and dispossessed. The Luo sect's version of popular Buddhism doesn't sound that bad or that threatening, but Luo's teachings infused the Boatmen's Guild with a spiritual unity, secret rituals and codes of conduct, and it gave them an excuse to collect and invest their members' dues. Imagine if the Teamsters Union doubled as a religious cult. What evolved was a self-financing counterweight to government authority, one that embraced a popular religion outside of imperial sanction, and was composed of rootless men who roamed all over this critical waterway. It was a private and seemingly lawless entity operating at the heart of an essential public service, responsible for supplying the capital with food. Most emperors and officials viewed the boatmen and their guild as a necessary evil. They were called a volatile bunch prone to riot and general rowdiness. But the Boatmen's Guild became so threatening that Qianlong, the great emperor of the 18th century, banned the guild and had its halls and temples demolished. That drove the movement underground. They were virtually impossible to uproot from the grain tribute apparatus. If anything, official attempts to dismantle the Boatmen's Guild only made the guild stronger and only destabilized the Grand Canal system and rendered the grain tribute even more vulnerable to blackmail by the guild. After the Luo sect was outlawed as a source of heresy and rebellion, the Boatmen's Guild became one of late imperial China's most notorious secret societies, famous for its smuggling, extortion, and protection rackets. And even after the grain tribute was suspended at the beginning of the 20th century, the Boatmen's Guild morphed into something called the Green Gang, Shanghai's most powerful and violent criminal syndicate of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. There are criminal syndicates in Asia today that trace their origins back to the Boatmen's Guild. It's hard to overstate the significance of the Grand Canal. In less than a decade, the Sui dynasty built a waterway that connected China's two great river systems and politically linked North and South China together, ending centuries of political fragmentation. In many ways, the Grand Canal created imperial unity. It was a means of economic integration, of governance, and of cultural exchange. It was the axis for the projection of imperial power south, and a conduit for southern wealth, material culture, and cultural sophistication moving north. It was an enabler of several golden ages that shaped the evolution of Chinese culture and society. Wealth transfer from the south would also prove critical to territorial expansion and imperial defense directed from the great northern capital at Beijing, a feat that was inconceivable without the Grand Canal. And here we have one of those paradoxes that we frequently find at the heart of imperial China's success story. During most of the period from the 13th to the 20th centuries, China was almost exclusively ruled from the north. And yet those northern dynasties were primarily fed and their government posts primarily filled by southerners. And the Grand Canal was definitely a mixed blessing. Over more than 1,000 years of imperial rule, it periodically loomed as a strength and as a vulnerability in political, strategic, and economic terms. It was a metaphor for the strengths and weaknesses of China's dynasties and of the imperial system itself.